In the silence of the Kremlin office, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock and the heavy breathing of those present, the fate of millions was being decided. On the enormous map spread across the table, red arrows seemed to pulsate, demanding movement. This was a moment of truth, dividing the history of the Great Patriotic War into before and after. Marshal Ivan Konev, a man with an iron gaze and an equally iron will, stood before the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. The air was so electrified that it seemed a random spark could ignite the heavy oak panels. The debate wasn't just about tactics, but about the very philosophy of war. Stalin, accustomed to the classic scheme of a single powerful blow that splits enemy defenses like lightning, insisted on concentrating all forces at one point. This was proven logic, an axiom of military science of that time: the fist must be unified. But Konev saw differently. His eyes, tired from sleepless nights, saw not a map, but the real landscape of western Ukraine, a complex tangle of forests, swamps, and rivers, where a single blow could get stuck like an axe in damp wood. He proposed something unheard of: to deliver two equally powerful, devastating blows simultaneously. To break the pattern, to scatter the enemy's attention, to make the German command frantically rush about, not knowing where exactly their defenses would crumble. Stalin, slowly lighting his pipe, looked at the marshal with unconcealed skepticism. This was a risk bordering on recklessness. To divide forces meant to weaken them. In tactical textbooks, this was called a mistake. But Konev insisted. He was staking not only his epaulets, but also the outcome of the entire summer campaign of '44. At that moment, when Stalin, after a heavy pause, uttered his famous, "Let it be your way," the mechanism of one of the most grandiose operations in the history of wars was launched. The Lvov-Sandomierz Operation began not with the firing of a cannon, but with a strong-willed decision to break the rules for the sake of victory. The situation on the front by midsummer 1944 resembled a tightly coiled spring. Operation Bagration was already thundering in Belarus, grinding down Army Group Center, and Berlin's attention was riveted there. The German command, hypnotized by the catastrophe in the center, was convinced that in the south, in Galicia, the Soviet Union would not be able to undertake anything large-scale. They believed in their fortifications, believed that the muddy season and difficult terrain would be their best allies. Army Group North Ukraine, under the command of General Joseph Harp, felt relatively confident. They had created deeply echeloned defenses, 3 lines of which seemed impenetrable. The Germans were counting on a respite, on the opportunity to regroup. They did not know that opposite them, in the forests and ravines, a force capable of moving mountains was hidden. The Soviet side carried out a colossal disinformation effort. It was a game of shadows, a masquerade of grand scale. Troop movements were carried out only at night. Tank columns were disguised as forest masses. Radio waves were silent or broadcast false information. Hundreds of mock tanks and guns were placed in false directions to mislead German air reconnaissance. And it worked. When at dawn on July 13, 1944, the silence was broken by the roar of thousands of guns, it came as a complete surprise to the German soldiers. But the beginning of the operation was not an easy triumph. Nature seemed to rebel against the advancing forces. Torrential rains turned roads into impassable rivers of mud. Aviation could not take to the sky, and artillery spotters saw only a gray shroud of rain and fog before them. Here, in the mud and chaos of the first hours of the offensive, the first layer of conflict began to unfold, the battle of man against matter and circumstances. Superficially, It looked like a clash of two gigantic war machines. On one side, the most powerful grouping of the First Ukrainian Front, numbering over 1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and thousands of aircraft. On the other, battle-hardened German divisions, relying on the concrete and steel of their fortifications. But behind the dry figures lay a drama of incredible tension. Soviet troops had to gnaw through the enemy's defenses literally meter by meter. German infantry, understanding that there was nowhere to retreat, resisted with the desperation of the doomed. Counterattacks followed one after another. Particularly fierce battles unfolded in the Rava-Ruska and Lviv directions. Those very 2 points of attack that Konev had insisted upon. It was here, in the triangle of forests and hills, that a situation began to form which would soon go down in history as the Brody Cauldron. This was not just an encirclement, it was a grandiose trap snapped shut with the clang of a steel jaw. 8 German divisions, including the infamous 14th SS Grenadier Division, Galicia, found themselves caught in a deadly vice. At first, it seemed like a tactical inconvenience for the Germans, but with each passing hour, the ring tightened, transforming the space within into a zone of absolute chaos. The German command refused to believe in the reality of the catastrophe until the last moment, demanding that the encircled units hold positions. But there was nothing left to hold. Inside the cauldron, something was happening that defied description in the dry language of reports. Imagine a huge, seething mass of people, equipment, and carts huddled in a limited area of forested terrain. Command and control of troops were lost on the very first day of complete isolation. German headquarters could not contact forward units. Orders contradicted each other. Elite Wehrmacht units, rear services, and collaborationist formations mingled in panic. Roads were jammed with abandoned equipment, burning trucks, and frantic horses. Over all this hung a thick, acrid smoke that obscured the sun. Soviet aviation, having finally gained air superiority, methodically worked over enemy concentrations. Il-2 attack aircraft approached their targets in waves, turning forest roads into fiery corridors. The Soviet command employed a fire bag tactic here. Artillery, positioned around the perimeter of the encirclement, conducted crossfire, raking the cauldron through and through. There was not a single square meter where one could find cover. The psychological tension inside the cauldron reached its limit. Enemy soldiers, accustomed to discipline and order, found themselves in a situation where no regulations worked. Attempts to break through were made chaotically, without proper reconnaissance and artillery support. Groups of German tanks tried to ram through the Soviet defenses, but ran into dense anti-tank barriers. Hysterical calls for help were heard on the radio, but Berlin remained silent, and attempts to relieve the encirclement from the outside were harshly suppressed by the outer front of the encirclement. The finale of the grouping became especially dramatic. Realizing the hopelessness of the situation, the Corps commander, General Artur Haufe, attempted to organize a final, desperate breakthrough to the southwest. It resembled an avalanche. Thousands of people, disfigured by days of tension, surged forward, disregarding losses. But Konev had foreseen this move. Fresh guards units and artillery batteries, set for direct fire, were already positioned along the likely breakthrough routes. The counter-battle was swift and brutal. The enormous grouping simply ceased to exist as an organized force. General Haufe was captured, tens of thousands of soldiers laid down their arms, and the forests near Brody became silent witnesses to the complete rout. The elimination of the Brody Cauldron not only destroyed 8 divisions, it created a gigantic breach in the German front, tens of kilometers wide, which they had nothing to close. While the remnants of the encircled grouping were burning out to the north, a maneuver unfolded to the south that many military historians call a masterpiece of operational art. General Pavel Rybalko's tank army faced a dilemma. Before it lay the so-called Koltovsky Corridor, a narrow breakthrough strip only a few kilometers wide covered by German artillery from both sides. To send an entire tank army into this bottleneck would have been madness by all canons of military science. Any stop of the lead vehicle, any jam, would have meant the inevitable destruction of the entire column, turning it into a stationary target. But Rybalko, this master of tank warfare, felt the rhythm of the battle in his skin. He understood. Time was more precious than safety. If they waited for the breakthrough to widen, the Germans would have time to bring up reserves, and he gave the order, "Forward!" This movement through the corridor resembled passing through the eye of a needle. Tanks moved in a dense column, literally side by side, in 2 rows. The air trembled from the roar of engines and the explosions of shells falling left and right. Dust and soot clogged the lungs. Driver mechanics, clutching the levers, drove their vehicles at maximum speed, understanding that the lives of thousands of comrades depended on their skill. If the Germans had managed to cut this artery, a huge mass of Soviet troops would have been trapped. But the speed and onslaught were such that the German artillerymen simply did not have time to adjust their aim. The steel avalanche broke through to operational space, bursting into the rear of the enemy's Lviv grouping. The culmination of this stage was the liberation of Lviv. The ancient city, a pearl of architecture, could have been turned into ruins if the Soviet command had decided to take it with a frontal assault using massive, heavy artillery. But Konev, understanding the city's cultural and historical value, took another tactical risk. The tank armies bypassed the city, taking it in pincers, and then, taking advantage of the garrison's confusion, burst into the streets. The street fighting was brutal, but swift. Tankers showed wonders of maneuverability in the narrow medieval streets, interacting with infantry assault groups. On July 27th, Lviv was completely cleared of the enemy. The red banner, hoisted over the town hall, became a symbol that Western Ukraine was returning home. However, the capture of Lviv was not the finale, but only a prelude to an even more difficult test. The Vistula lay ahead. This great river was the last major natural barrier before the borders of the Third Reich. Wide, full-flowing, with a swift current, it seemed an insurmountable obstacle. The German command placed its last hopes on the Vistula. They believed that the Russians, exhausted by weeks of offensive, having broken away from their rear for hundreds of kilometers, would stop here. The Germans blew up bridges, drove away all watercraft, and mined the approaches. Fortifications were hastily erected on the western bank. But what happened at the end of July on the banks of the Vistula cannot be explained by military logic alone. It was a triumph of the human spirit and engineering improvisation. The advanced detachments of the First Ukrainian Front reached the river near Sandomierz, and immediately, without preparation, began crossing. They had neither standard pontoons nor heavy bridge layers. All of that was far behind, stuck on broken roads. But the soldiers understood. If they stopped now, giving the enemy even an hour of respite, the waters of the Vistula would turn red with blood during a future assault. The crossing began spontaneously, on anything that could keep a person afloat. Fishing boats found in coastal reeds, rafts hastily knocked together from dismantled sheds and fences, empty fuel barrels, and straw-stuffed ground sheets were all used. Sappers worked in icy water for days under continuous enemy fire. Imagine a sapper's work at a crossing. German junkers howl overhead, diving at every boat. The water boils from machine gun fire, and you have to tie logs, drive piles, pull ropes. Personal stories from those days are astonishing. Sergeant Pyotr Vorobyov, commander of a sappers squad, and his men assembled a ferry from captured barrels overnight under fire, on which the first anti-tank guns were transported. When a rope was severed by a shell fragment, 2 soldiers plunged into the water and held the ferry by hand while the others rowed with shovels and rifle butts. They understood that without the guns, the infantry on the other bank was doomed. On tiny patches of land captured on the western bank, infantrymen dug into the sand, repelling 10 to 15 counterattacks a day. They ran out of ammunition, had no food, but they held on, knowing that their comrades were building bridges behind them. German aviation hung over the crossings around the clock. Bombs ripped through the water, raising fountains as high as a house. Pontoon crews perished in entire detachments, but others took their place. The construction of low-water bridges proceeded at rates that seemed fantastic. Engineers used a trick. They built bridges half a meter below the water level. From the air, such a crossing was invisible to pilots. It seemed that trucks and tanks were driving directly on water. This decision saved thousands of lives and allowed heavy equipment to be transferred to the bridgehead. It was this continuous, round-the-clock feat of people in wet tunics, working at the limit of human capabilities, that allowed the narrow strips of captured bank to be transformed into the powerful Sandomierz bridgehead. The capture of the bridgehead on the western bank of the Vistula marked a moment of transformation for the entire strategic situation. From a tactical success, it turned into a knife pointed at the heart of Germany. The Germans perfectly understood the threat. If the Russians held on here, there would be a direct path to Berlin. Hitler personally ordered the elimination of the bridgehead at all costs. Elite tank divisions, equipped with the latest wonder weapon, heavy King Tiger tanks, were transferred here. These steel monsters, weighing almost 70 tons, with powerful frontal armor and long-range guns, were supposed to be the irresistible argument of the Reich. The German command expected to throw Soviet troops into the river with one powerful blow. In early August, a drama unfolded near the village of Oglendow, which became the culmination of the entire battle for the bridgehead. The Germans, confident in the invulnerability of their new machines, went on the offensive. On a foggy morning, the huge silhouettes of King Tigers began to creep out of the forest. The ground trembled from their weight. It seemed that nothing could stop this steel armada. But Soviet tank crews were ready. The front command, anticipating a counterattack, skillfully set up ambushes. T-34 tanks and heavy IS-2s were camouflaged in haystacks, in bushes, in folds of terrain. They let the enemy approach to dagger fire range. This was a moment of truth in the confrontation between armor and projectile, but most importantly, in the confrontation of characters. The crew of Guards Junior Lieutenant Alexander Oskin, in their T-34, accomplished what seemed impossible. Lying in ambush, he coldly waited until the lead German tanks exposed their less protected sides and opened fire. With the very first shot, the lead King Tiger was put out of action. 2 more burst into flames subsequently. The much-vaunted German machinery proved powerless against the skill and composure of the Soviet tank crewmen. Panic seized the German crews. The unwieldy giants began to thrash about, exposing themselves to the fire of other ambush groups. The debut of the King Tigers turned into a complete fiasco. Several of the newest vehicles were captured completely intact and sent to Moscow for study. This battle became a symbol of the collapse of the Nazis' last hopes for technological salvation. The battle for the Sandomierz bridgehead continued throughout August. It was a gigantic mill, grinding down the Wehrmacht's best reserves. Soviet aviation dominated the skies. Il-2 attack aircraft ironed out German positions, giving them no chance to raise their heads. Artillery created a wall of fire, sweeping away everything in its path. By the end of the month, the bridgehead was not just held, but significantly expanded. It became a giant springboard on which forces began to accumulate for the decisive thrust to the west. The Lvov-Sandomierz Operation concluded with a complete strategic victory for the Red Army. Army Group North Ukraine was routed and ceased to exist as a unified force. Western Ukraine was completely liberated. The significance of this victory extended far beyond military geography. The resonance of the events of the summer of '44 is heard even today. The Lvov-Sandomierz Operation became a classic of military art. It showed that patterns exist to be broken. Konev's trident, as his double-strike strategy is sometimes called, is studied in military academies around the world as an example of how unconventional thinking triumphs over brute force. But there is also a deeper, universal human lesson. This operation showed that even the most perfect machine of suppression, which the Nazi Reich was, is powerless before the unified will of people defending their right to exist. It reminded us that history is made not only by generals in offices, but also by ordinary people. Those sappers in the icy water of the Vistula, those tank crewmen in the stuffy turrets near Oglendu, those infantrymen who advanced, overcoming fear. The paradox of this battle is that it was precisely the complexity and unpredictability of the Ukrainian theater of military operations on which the Germans had so relied that became the cause of their defeat. Konev turned the disadvantages of the terrain into his advantages, using every ravine and every forest for covert maneuver. This teaches us that in any, even the most desperate situation, there is always an unconventional solution if there is the will to find it and the courage to implement it. Furthermore, the operation had colossal geopolitical consequences. The advance to the Vistula and the creation of the bridgehead virtually predetermined the fate of Poland and opened the gates to Germany. This was the very stone that triggered the avalanche that buried the Third Reich. Returning mentally to that Kremlin office where it all began, we see how thin the line is between triumph and catastrophe. If Konev had given in then, if he hadn't found the courage to contradict Stalin, history might have taken a different path. The war could have dragged on for many more months, claiming millions of additional lives. The determination of one man, multiplied by the heroism of millions, changed the map of Europe. The two red arrows on the map, which initially so irritated the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, turned into two swords that cut through the darkness of occupation. The Sandomierz bridgehead remained in history not just as a patch of land on a riverbank, but as a symbol that the impossible becomes possible when behind you is truth, and ahead is a goal for which it is worth risking everything. This story reminds us that victory is forged not only with iron, but also with intellect, audacity, and faith in one's righteousness. And the echo of those cannonades over the Vistula sounds as a reminder: there are no fortresses that people united by a great goal cannot take. We gaze into the faces of the soldiers in archival newsreels. They are smiling, they are smoking makorka, they are cleaning their weapons. They have just accomplished the impossible. Behind them is liberated Lviv. Before them is the road to Berlin. In their eyes there is no fear, only the calm confidence of people who know that they are doing the most important work on earth: cleansing it of evil. And as long as the memory of that summer of '44 lives, as long as we remember the price paid for every meter of that land, the lessons of the Lviv-Sandomierz Operation will remain relevant, warning the world against new mistakes and reminding us of the greatness of the human spirit.